When was the last time you felt angry or bothered or uncomfortable? Maybe because of bad traffic or because of bad air quality caused by air pollution, or even my personal pet peeves, which is long queues at immigration and customs. I just arrived from overseas yesterday, and this is the first thing that I saw when I landed in Indonesia. So what caused these things? These are caused by bad policies. Now, the question is, who formulated or created or made policies? The answer is the government, right? And some of you might be familiar with the concept of government. There are three branches of the government. The executive, so that is the president, the ministers, the cabinet, the parliament. In Indonesia, we'll call them DPR. And the third one is the judiciary. In Indonesia, we call them as the Supreme Court. So the executive, so let me start with the parliament. The parliament is the one who creates policy. The executive is the one who executes policies. And the judiciary is the one who oversees the implementation of policies. Now, if we take a look at the system, right? So the one who creates most policies are the parliament. Now, let's take a deep dive into why do we have bad policies. Sometimes we have bad policies not because our government is inherently bad and they want to create bad policies, but sometimes let's give them a little bit, the benefit of the doubt that they make bad policies not because of they're bad, but because they don't know yet what is good. So, to understand further on how policies are being made, I'd like to take a double click on the statistics of the age of the members of parliament in Indonesia. So, in Indonesia, we have 560 members of parliament representing the 34 of our provinces. And from this 560, the average age of them is 51.62. That's quite old. And then the oldest member of parliament in Indonesia is aged 80. So you can imagine 80-year-old trying to make policies for young people, right? And then how about the young people itself? How many of them are involved in policy making? In Indonesia, according to the International Parliamentary Union, the percentage of young people aged less than 30-year-old joining Indonesia's parliament is just well below 4%. Particularly, it's at 3.83%. So you can imagine how small that number is. So from 560, only 3% are young people under the age of 30. Now, how can we possibly make good policies for young people in this country if young people are not involved in policy-making process, if young people are not involved in determining and deciding their own future? But what if I tell you if we can change things? If you guys can try to address bad traffic or can try to address, bad queues at immigration. So that was me 5 years ago, or probably 6. I was in Vietnam representing young people of Indonesia at the APEC Youth Summit. So basically in this forum, 21 member economies of APEC, which includes China, the US, Russia, Indonesia included, they were discussing on the future of the region, how these countries or these governments want to see the future of economies in Asia Pacific. They discussed about climate change, they discussed about digitalization, they discussed about MSMEs, and how can they empower young people better, for example, through education. So that was me trying to convince APEC leaders on how to strengthen the support of governments across the Asia Pacific in empowering MSMEs, in providing better education for young people, in boosting their action on climate change. And this was me a couple of months back, fast forward 5 years later, still doing the same thing, convincing the government to do the right thing on what our visions are as young people, on what do we want to see in the world, but this time in a different stage, which is the G20, which Indonesia is hosting this year. So why is it important? Why is young people's participation in policymaking important? First of all, we understand that if old people create policies for us, they don't know what our priorities are, what our concerns are. So we understand that as young people, more and more young people are getting more concerned about climate change. But probably that's not the case for older people, right? Same with the case of digitalization, for example. All of us, especially you guys, were born as digital native. You were born with technologies. While older people, they understand or they get to know technology when they were in their 20s or in their 30s. So how can they possibly understand the state that you're in if they don't experience the same thing as you are? So how to address this? We should include young people in policy making. We should include the perspective of young people on how to create better policies. So to understand better about policy-making process, I'd like to invite you to imagine, what would Indonesia look like in 23 years' time? What would Indonesia look like in 2045, the centennial of our independence? So to understand better, let's take a look at the statistics by the Indonesian government. By 2045, our population is expected to grow to 300 million. And our economic annual growth will be steadily at 5 to 6%. That's a good growth. Our GDP will be at $9 trillion US dollars. And the per capita income will be at 29,000 US dollars. So to put it into perspective, that size of economic growth will be twice as large as what Japan has today, and 3 times as large of that of Britain's. So you can imagine how big our country will be, the size of our wealth. So if you go to Japan or if you go to the UK, you see that they're developed because of their wealth. They can create good policies for young people. So imagine that scenario for Indonesia in 20 years' time. But is that given? Is that a fact? Is that guaranteed? The answer is no, that is not guaranteed. But how can we unlock this? How can we unlock this potential so that Indonesia in 2045 can have this as a reality? Now, to understand this, I'd like to introduce you to a concept called demographic dividend. Some of you might have heard of this, some of you might have understood this, but for those of you who haven't, demographic dividend is defined as, by the United Nations as the economic growth potential that can result from shifts in a population's age structure, mainly when the share of the working age population is larger than the non-working age share of the population. So what does it mean? To put it simply, in 2045, the size of Indonesia's population, the 300 million, we will have a bulk of young people in their productive age contributing to the economy. So productive age by the United Nations is defined as from 18 to 60. So more than 50% of Indonesia's population will be at this segment. And then if we manage to unlock their potentials, then we can grow our economy because these people can contribute to economic activities. But have you heard of demographic catastrophe? I define demographic catastrophe as the opposite, as the complete opposite of demographic dividend. So what does it look like? Demographic catastrophe will happen if more than 50% of Indonesia's population in their productive age, right? If they cannot contribute to the economy and the economic development of our country. So, how to avoid demographic catastrophe? My answer to this is meaningful youth participation. So young people should be included, so should participate meaningfully to policy-making process so that they can decide what the future of our country would be. It is very important for young people to have a say on what kind of education they want to have, what kind of future in terms of climate change they want to see. Young people should be asking and continuously asking whether the government has done enough to stop climate change, whether the government has done enough in protecting our personal data that we share through our use of internet. So just to give you a perspective, at the G20, Indonesia is today leading the G20 as the presidency. In fact, we will host the summit in 2 days' time. And then why it is important for Indonesia and for young people to be included in policy-making process at the G20 level, especially when Indonesia is the presidency. So the G20 represents 80% of global GDP. It represents 75% of international commerce and 60% of world's population. So here we're talking about China, we're talking about the US, we're talking about the European Union as an entity, we're talking about Indonesia and India as emerging markets. So the G20 is very big, and that is why it is important for young people from Indonesia to be involved in G20, to decide what the G20 governments are deciding, are agreeing on, because that will have a trickle-down effect on Indonesia and therefore our future in 23 years' time. But the journey doesn't stop here. Indonesia will not just be the presidency of G20 this year, but we will also host ASEAN next year as a chairman. So why it is also important for young people to be involved in ASEAN policymaking process? It's because according to Government Indonesia's data, 33% of the population in ASEAN are young people. And then, by 2020, there have been 35 unicorns founded by young people, which in turn contribute $8.2 billion to ASEAN's economy. So you can imagine that is the state of young people in ASEAN today. What about the state of young people in Indonesia and in ASEAN in 23 years' time? So now I'd like to invite you to think about the how. How can you participate? For me, I participated as a youth delegate at the G20. I tried to influence policy making there by giving G20 leaders, presidents, prime ministers with the views, the perspectives from young people. We gathered voices from young people, and we formulate policy recommendations, and we deliver it to the president. But how can you get involved? You can get involved by a lot of ways. I mean, being a Y20 delegate is one of them, but it is not the only way. There are a lot of ways to contribute. For example, by joining communities, by joining organizations to channel your views and your opinions. Now, I'd like to give you 4 practical steps on how can we as young people can avoid demographic catastrophe. Number 1, we need to educate ourselves on the issues that matter. In order to meaningfully participate in policy-making process, we need to understand the policy landscape in the first place. For example, if you're interested in climate change and you want to influence policies in surrounding climate change, you need to understand what climate change entails. It is not just caused by, pollutions from cars or from factories. Climate change is caused by, the design of our economic activities and architecture at the global level that are so intertangled with each other, from the way we plug in, from the way we grow things, from the way we move around, and these activities generate emissions. So, as young people, we need to understand how complex things are before we meaningfully participate in policy making. And this applies to other issues as well. If you're interested in digital transformation, if you're interested in education, you need to understand the complexity of the issue first before you go into policy making. So number 2, try to mainstream or amplify. So what do I mean by this? In order to meaningfully participate in policy-making process, you can test your ideas and your visions with your most immediate environment. It can be your friends, your peers, your family, your communities. You can test your ideas. Try to mainstream your visions and try to mainstream the issues so that you can gather people's awareness as well. Number 3, intervene or take action. So this is what I call, what I mean by intervene or take action is to try to start participating, either try to influence policymaking or even start with your immediate environments. But in political context, intervene or take action can also be translated into voting. So I know that most of you are still high school students, but in a couple of years' time, you will get your KTP and you will be able to vote. And it is very important for young people to vote not based on identity, but based on issues. So if you're into climate change, vote for candidates that, advocate for climate change as their priorities. If you're into digital transformation and protection of your privacy, then you should vote for candidates that advocate for personal data protection. Number 4 is empower. Empower means that we need to understand first that not all young people are born with the same privilege as we did, right? There are a lot of young people out there who do not have access to influencing policy-making process, who do not even have access to basic education. So to enable meaningful youth participation at all levels in this country, we need to remember that there are a lot of young people out there who do not have access, and we need to empower them. We need to give them access and to utilize our privilege to empower more young people so that they can participate meaningfully in policy-making process. Now, before I close my talk, I'd like to look back to the beginning of my talk this morning. I asked you, when was the last time you felt angry? Now, I'd like to invite you that the next time you feel angry, take time to think about it. And you can use that as an opportunity to change things, to bring Indonesia for the better. Thank you.